began to research my family history, I slowly realised that it was much easier to find parish records for my maternal ancestors than for some of my paternal ones, and there were a few reasons for this. Firstly, I was only using online resources. Now, with 20 years experience, I can fully appreciate that even today a lot of church records just have not been digitised and have not been converted into searchable databases on the internet. The internet doesn't have everything. This applies particularly to Catholic records, which also explains why most of the online Catholic baptisms, marriages and occasional burials that I've connected to my own family tree are the result of volunteer-led projects. For instance, the index to the Catholic cemetery at Ford near Liverpool, that's still underway. A lot of the registers for St Mary's at Brownedge near Bamber Bridge have been transcribed, and they're actually available on the excellent Lancashire Online Parish Clerk website, which you can search completely for free, and I'll put a link to that in the description box. Another difficulty is that, unlike with the Anglican church records, Roman Catholic records do not legally have to be deposited in the local archives. In some cases they actually prefer, because of the way that churches are organised, to store them at the appropriate archives for whatever diocese the church happens to fall under. In the case of Lancashire churches, that can sometimes be Salford and it can sometimes be Liverpool. It just depends on where they are within the county boundary. So accessing Catholic records is not always quite as easy as it first appears. You're not necessarily just going to be able to walk into the county record office and load up a microfilm and away you go, everything back to the year dot. And to complicate things further, it is actually quite rare to find Catholic registers that predate the mid-1700s. To understand why this is the case, we really have to go back in time another 2 centuries. In fairness to Elizabeth I, she did attempt to find some sort of middle ground designed to please both Anglicans and Catholics and the other branches of religion that were starting to come up in her reign, including the Puritans. Don't think she liked Puritans very much. But unfortunately, various events, things like the Babington plot, where they tried to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, did lead to several anti-Catholic laws being passed. Perhaps we should consider the following. In 1581, recusancy, or failing or refusing to attend Anglican church, becomes a formal offence. The fine for recusancy is raised from merely a shilling to £20 a month. In 1585, the Act Against Priests was passed. Englishmen who went abroad to train to be Catholic priests were barred from returning to England. And if you were caught helping or sheltering a priest, as I think, for instance, St Margaret Clitheroe was, you risked the death penalty. And St Margaret Clitheroe was indeed pressed to death for harbouring priests. In 1587, the Recusancy Act declares that if you are a recusant, 2/3 of your land can legally be confiscated. So by this time, if you are such a committed Catholic that you still decide not to attend Anglican church, you were going to be viewed as a troublemaker. There just was no freedom of religion back then. And because of these troublemaking Catholics, and other people who wouldn't conform to the Anglican faith, people started to keep records of their names. So in this video, I'm going to explore 4 of the more unusual resources from the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries that may help you to trace Catholics and recusants, particularly in the county of Lancashire. Recusants in the Pipe Rolls, an unusual sounding collection of records, but what will it actually tell you? Generally speaking, you get a couple of lines about each recusant. Not a great deal of information, but enough that you can work out where somebody lived and how they earned a living, or some other clue to their social status. For example, Richard Aspinwall of Latham in Ormskirk Parish in Lancashire, a schoolmaster. On the 17th of March 1589, he was convicted of being a recusant for a 12-month period, beginning from the 30th of July 1587. So that was the point at which he hadn't been attending the Anglican church services, and it would be 12 months from there. It isn't clear from the records whether he caved in and started going to church again in July 1588, or whether that was simply the point when the authorities decided that they'd got enough evidence against Richard to go in for a conviction. Women are also named in these records. Alice Clifton, the widow of Cuthbert Clifton, a gentleman. Alice is from Westby near Kirkham, in the northern part of Lancashire. She's also convicted for 12 months recusancy, beginning in this case from the 20th of September 1589, and it's also noted that her property was seized on the 15th of April 1591 and became the property of the Crown, who could do with it what they liked. And the note then goes on to say, on the 25th of June that year, somebody called Edward Bradshaw was allowed to lease it, so it was taken from Alice and given to somebody else. Even something as simple as that can have an interesting side effect, because that can help to explain how and why land may have passed from one family to another family, even without the two being connected in any way by something like marriage. That might be the answer as to why these things happened. Confusingly, protestation returns are nothing to do with Protestants. They are actually another kind of list of recusants, and this particular example I'm looking at covers a section of what is now the southwestern part of Lancashire, and also ventures into Merseyside. It was all Lancashire back then. It describes itself as a roll or calendar of the names of all the convicted recusants. It goes on to clarify that it's a combined list of everybody who is over the age of 16 who has not attended Anglican church, and also everybody who is over 21 who hasn't taken communion in an Anglican church, because this was a big factor too, for at least a year. What is immediately useful about that list and that extra detail is that you know that nobody on the list will have been born after about 1625. If you were a single person on this list, you would get fined 16 pence. Married couples are fined 24 pence. They get a bit of a discount. Married couples discount. What kind of information can we find on this protestation returns? Sometimes you simply get a very simple list, a bit like this extract for Altker near Formby. And on other occasions, you will actually get defined relationships between the different people on the list. It just depends how people decided to take the list. It's notable in the records for Down Holland there that Robert Tasker himself is not listed. You can form a family group from that little bit of information, but you cannot actually be certain that Catherine and Robert didn't have other children at this point in time. All we can deduce is that if they did have any, they would have been under 16 years old. Maybe like their father, the sons of the Tasker family actually attended Anglican church and so were not liable to be fined as recusants. The records that I have looked at that are similar to these would suggest that it is not completely unusual to find the males conforming where the females rebelled and stuck by the Catholic faith, which is an interesting social and familial divide. Although I can't find a burial record for Robert on the internet, I'm sure there are some out there, but because of the time when he's living, it's actually during the Commonwealth period, after the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I. So record keeping for parish churches became a bit patchy then. There was a bit of a move towards what we'd call civil registration today, rather than religious registration, so there are a lot of missing gaps in church registers at this time. However, the Lancashire Archives catalogue does tell us that there is a probate record for Robert Tasker, a yeoman of Down Holland, in the parish of Holsall. That ties in quite nicely, and that is dated the 23rd of July 1661. That very possibly could be our Robert. There is also a burial record that would seem to match his wife Catherine. So, using that information that we can glean from these various records, we have got enough information to assemble a very basic Tasker family tree. The more things move on, the more they stay the same sometimes. Here is a similar resource to the collection that I've just looked at. This is a list of convicted recusants in the reign of Charles II, so we're only actually moving on about 25-26 years. Some Catholics were so committed to their faith that whatever the law said, they were prepared to risk huge fines rather than attend their nearest Anglican church. And people actually were fined, it was not a mere threat. As this excellent example shows from Walton-le-Dale, near Preston, this dates from just after the time of the Great Fire of London. And what is even better about it is that it tells us how these people earned a living, which is excellent from a social history perspective. The notable thing about those records is that they have, of course, been Latinised. You get a lot of Latin in these early records, so they need to be decoded. And fortunately, as you can see, it is not too difficult. Ricardus is Richard, Anna is Anne, it might be Anna as well. Evanus, Evan, Tomai, Thomas, and Johannes is John, of course. In terms of occupation, what are these people actually doing? A webster is an old name for a weaver. A husbandman is farming land that he rents from somebody else. This is distinct from a yeoman who actually owns the land that he farms. A tanner is making leather. And alehouse keeper is a pretty obvious one. So just by looking at those few examples there, we get an idea of where these particular recusants ranked in general society. Probably not wealthy, but in spite of this, they are still prepared to stick by the Catholic faith in spite of the fines. Papists. Interesting term, isn't it? Probably deriving from papacy, which is related to the Pope. Generally speaking, it is used in a kind of derogatory fashion, a way of criticising people, a way of marking them out, but essentially it means that they are Catholics. And the word is clearly still in use by 1767, when this return of Papists is made. The one that I'm looking at here, which apparently is one of the best surviving collections, is the collection that applies to the Diocese of Chester, which actually does cover a good deal of Lancashire. It's not unlike a census. The one variable factor is that the returns for each place were not necessarily taken on the same day. I think somebody was going around with a book and writing names down. For instance, in North Mells, or Southport as we now call it, the list is taken on the 20th of August. In nearby Scarisbrick, the names are taken on the 31st of August. And in Bickerstaff, which is a little further away again, the exact poll of the Papists was taken on the 1st of September. You might even argue in this situation that it is something of an advantage if your ancestors were Catholic, because the records provide evidence of who was living in a particular town, what their occupations were, and also who their family members were, and sometimes extra people that they lived with, such as apprentices. Even better, it tells us how long people had been living in that particular town, so you may even be able to work out that they had moved from another area. We see this example here that shows more or less exactly that in the case of Henry Preston. Perhaps he wasn't born in Ormskirk, but he lived there most of his life. There are a few gaps in that record, but with a bit of detective work it is possible to fill those missing pieces in and complete a jigsaw. Henry's eldest daughter Margaret was 8 years old, so we can guess that he must have got married around 1758-59. The youngest, Alice, is only a newborn. She's 16 days old. Which raises the question, where is her mother? Why is her mother not on that return of Papists? There are two possibilities, of course. Maybe Mrs. Preston has died within the past 16 days, possibly after childbirth. Or perhaps Henry Preston has married a woman who is not a Catholic. Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1753, which I referenced in one of my Pride and Prejudice and family history videos, said that to be considered legally binding, a wedding had to take place in an Anglican church in front of at least 2 witnesses. And consequently, you tend to find that a lot of Catholic people did get married in a Church of England church. Henry Preston definitely did. There is evidence of it. Then when you actually cross-reference the details about Henry's family with the Catholic records for the parish of Ormskirk, which have been in existence for about 35 years at this point, you find that there are several baptisms coming up which match almost exactly with the names of the children on the returns. But clearly we are living in a time here, in the 1760s, where being a Catholic is not really too acceptable. And so the Catholic chapel was just that. It was a chapel. It did not have a graveyard. So more or less everybody was buried in the nearest Anglican churchyard. The Prestons were certainly buried at Ormskirk. But it's always worth looking further into these records, because just next door, in the very next house we presume, we find another Preston family recorded on the Papist returns. Now this is an interesting development, because Henry Preston has got a son called Matthew. We've seen that, and now we've got another Matthew coming up. Sadly, the Catholic parish registers for Ormskirk do not start until 1736, so I haven't been able to locate the baptism of Henry, who would have been born about 1730. But those same registers do include records for Matthew's daughter Marjorie, and also his illegitimate grandchild. So clearly, a Matthew Preston was in the right area, attending a church of the right denomination at the right time to be Henry's dad. We can't be sure, but he's a good candidate. And there are also some other burials which help us to map out the other members of Matthew Preston's family. So if we start to put together the information that is offered by the Papist returns, the Anglican Church records and the Catholic Church records, it is possible to create a theoretical family tree for this Preston family, who do seem to have been Roman Catholics. But perhaps the most interesting part of all of this is that 24 years after those 1716 returns of Papists were taken, people had gradually become less and less suspicious of Catholics. It was now a long time since the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 45, which were pro-Scottish and pro-Catholic, and the combination of the two did not really help matters for Catholics in England. By the 1790s, there is a lot more toleration, a lot more acceptance towards Catholics. In 1791, the Catholic Relief Act is passed, and this finally allows them to have their own chapels and their own schools. But there is a really good chance, when we consider who was who in the Preston family tree, that by the time Henry Preston's children were old enough to have families of their own, if they did, they were probably going to Mass on Sunday, maybe the children were going to school if they could afford it, and they probably didn't even give it a second thought. So, haven't things changed in, 200 years? There are all sorts of records, as we can see, some with very strange names that are out there. If you know where to find them, a lot of them have been digitised and put on the internet, in a lot of them in digitised book form, so they're worth looking out for too. So I hope that this was in some way useful if you happen to be a bit stuck with Catholic ancestors. I have certainly been stuck with mine in the past, and in some cases I still am stuck with them. Answers on a postcard, please, to anybody who knows where George Hurst, born about 1703, somewhere in Lancashire, might be hiding, because I'd like to know who his mum and dad were. Until my next video, bye for now, and I hope this one was of some use and some interest. Thanks for listening.